Welcome back to Questing Beast. I'm Ben. Today we're taking a look at The Forgotten Rites of the Moldering Dead. This is a sourcebook of the dead, undead, and rotting to inject randomness and new life into the classic undead monsters. It's written by Don Stroud, and it is designed for dungeon crawl classics. However, the stuff inside is fairly system neutral, so I think it'll work quite well for basically any fantasy role-playing game. Here's our back cover where we see some of the features that the book is going to contain. Before we continue, quick shout out to some of our new patrons over on Patreon, including people like Simon Laws, the Ohr Gaming Network, and Raymond Weinheimer. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. So some of the things we're going to get here is almost 100 tables to liven up the undead, some stat blocks, some tables for new spell books, some new spells, tips on turning into a necromancer, a new class, a demi-patron, a level 0 funnel, which is great if you're just starting out. This is where you get 4 level 0 characters. So each player is controlling 4 people, and you run through an adventure where a lot of your characters are going to die, and hopefully at least one makes it out the other side, and then that can be your new PC. It's kind of a Dungeon Crawl Classics thing. And a Hex Crawl adventure that you can use as is, or slap it into your own campaign setting. So inside this book, as you can probably tell from the title, it's going to focus very heavily on the undead. So if your campaign has a lot of undead as enemies, if they just show up a lot, or if your main arch enemy is undead, this could add a lot of variety and flavor to that. If your campaign does not contain a lot of those things, probably going to be less useful. So it's specific to the sort of campaign you're running. A lot of great black and white art here. As usual, I will put down in the description below links to where you can pick this up for yourself. So first of all, we have Chapter 1, The Smell of Death Surrounds You. What's that smell? So you roll a d6, and that takes you to other tables where you have all sorts of undead things that could be the source of what you're smelling. So it could be undead hordes, a dragonfall, fields of death, undead beasts, corpse plants, and fungal gardens, or weird death, undead, and other unnaturals. There's lots of other tables built in here, like a table of scavengers. But right off, we get the first of our big tables linked from What's That Smell? So undead hordes could be things like mummies, ghouls, skeletons. And then as you roll each one, you have a number of entries on a subtable, basically, that adds even more detail. So it could be cold children hunt for living souls to extinguish. In the vampires, it could be the local count rides on a black coach with D4 plus 2 wolves and 2 betrothed vampires. Some generals, a dragon falls. So if a dragon falls from the sky and dies and things are eating its corpse, then there's going to be repercussions for that. It could be host-specific parasites for dragons. That's a great little touch there, the parasites that will feed on dragons. Fields of death. So this could be a battlefield, or it could be a recent battlefield, a mass die-off of animals. It could be livestock mutilations, a small church or family cemetery. Really, I think most of these tables would be used separately. I don't know if you would necessarily use it with the 1d6 table at the beginning, where it's What's That Smell? Because some of these things wouldn't necessarily make sense to find, right? Like if you're in a dungeon and your players say, "What's that smell?" and you roll on the table and you get a giant battlefield, might not make a lot of sense. But the tables are quite useful as is. Undead beasts. Some of these tables are quite comprehensive. One thing I'm not a huge fan of is the way that we aren't using a 2-column format. It's all 1 column. So especially as we go on, there's definitely some entries that are these gigantic blocks of text, which I did not find very easy to read or to parse. So having skinnier margins or skinnier columns and using like bullet points or bolding, I think would have gone a long way to just make this easier to read and interpret. We have a whole bunch of corpse plants and fungal gardens, something that's often neglected. Some weird death, undead, and other unnaturals. For example, veins are running through everything. When tapped, they release a vapor much like blood. And then maybe an additional little feature to that. Prehensile veins latch onto anything within reach. Anyone grabbed is now mind-fused with a nervous cluster. DC 13 will save to escape from the cluster. Because this is a Dungeon Crawl Classics module or expansion, it tends to use the funky dice that Dungeon Crawl Classics has. So you're going to see stuff like, a D4 14 roll or a D30. The type of dice you don't typically see in D&D. But there is ways to emulate that with normal dice, or you can just get a random number generator. Different types of zombies here, including Romero's zombies. Different types of mummies. Mummy's curse triggers and effects. So it could be by disturbing the dead in any way or taking something from the tomb. There are some pretty creative, interesting ideas in here, but I think by and large, it's more of a comprehensive roundup of everything undead. So you're going to get more variety rather than a lot of super original ideas. It's more just filling you in with all the things you may not be thinking of off the top of your head. Though there are some fun ideas in here. Different types of ghostly attacks. So it could be something like invisible claws, sticky ectoplasm, screaming or other loud sounds, possession of a member of the group. One thing is that this book does seem to be well bound in that the pages don't seem loose or anything like that. But because of the glue binding and the rather narrow spine, it really does not want to stay open. It's actually very stiff, which is a little annoying. I wish it would have stayed open a little better. Different types of ghouls that we can run into here. A lot of this art is really great. Like, that is a great piece of artwork. I'm not totally sure which artist did this one, but I've seen a couple other pieces that I can tell are from this guy, and they're really excellent. Lots of vampire varieties. Liches. What kind of phylactery? Right? It could be a geode, could be a glass eye, a small locked box, a type of jewelry. Where's the phylactery located? What's the Lich's background? You can really flesh out that type of character. Some of the pieces of art like this is really great too. Like, it's just a great stylistic frame to put these tables inside of. Mini bestiary of scavengers. How to turn the undead. Treatment of the undead. This is just a big random table compilation, basically. How the dead are carried, the state of the deceased, death barges. So you have a whole bunch of rituals here that you can connect culturally to your setting in order to make death a little bit more interesting. Different types of tombs you can find people in. Ancient technology of the ancient. So this works well if you are dungeon delving into any sort of tomb. What's in the grave? That's a great random table. If players are going to go grave robbing, you have D100 things that they could run into. A lot of it is treasure, but let's see if we can find things that are a bit more interesting than that. For example, pink light sears from the skies with a skull-shattering crack. Whoever gets hit by it gains a skill at random. Or bones shattered but fused back together with gold. If touched, the gold flows into the victim, causing 1d12 damage, but provides 2 points of damage resistance. Good stuff. Some rumors about the dead and undying. For example, the dwarves were not undone by dragon or demon, but by a ghoul grown wise in his old age. A new king rules under the mountain. The Necromancer. So you can get some new spellbook designs here, including new latches, ways to open the book, the inks that are being used to really flavor up those necromancy books. Grave Shroud. I believe we're getting into some necromancy spells here. Because this is Dungeon Crawl Classics, they have very elaborate spell descriptions, including lots of different possible effects. You are rolling to accomplish your spells, and the higher you roll, the more powerful the spell becomes generally. Makes things much more wild and chaotic. We have the Blood Sphere Siphon. The caster is able to draw blood out of an opponent, animate it, and use it in various ways. The most powerful of these is the caster exsanguinates the target, causing 8d4 damage as a cosmic siphon connects to the target and pulls 1d10 plus 1 blood spheres, which may be placed by the caster within 30 feet of the target. So you can really just suck all the blood out of someone. Skeletal Embrace. Invoking the anger of the dead, the caster calls upon them to grasp their enemies, keeping them entangled and draining their life. It goes all the way up to summoning a gigantic skull to swallow things in its path. The Mantle of Tenebrious Flames. Corporeal Agglutination, a hideous resurrection. So it allows you to So let's read what it says here. An experienced necromancer has a vast knowledge of death and undeath and has spent a great deal of time experimenting with the boundaries of life and dead. A small number of become arrogant enough to tamper with the godlike powers of resurrection. This spell is capable of capturing and binding the disembodied soul to a person's body, granting it a sort of extension of life at the cost of the vitality of said body and probably any chances at redemption of the caster or subject of the spell. The Undead Hunter, a new type of class that you can be. Maybe a Hellboy type character or a Van Helsing, which I suppose was what the cleric was originally in D&D, but this focuses more on that. Some special abilities include things like being able to turn the undead, a bit like a cleric. You're really good at undead lore, you just know a lot about them. Before an epic battle against a truly legendary undead foe, hunters can spend a couple hours in research and accumulating the necessary supplies to outfit the party for the final showdown. Make a luck check, and if failed, the preparations are ruined by a brooding melancholy, terrifying nightmares, or an attack by minions to disrupt the preparations. If you pass, then you're just much better at fighting that enemy. We have a patron. If you're playing Dungeon Crawl Classics, there are supernatural patrons that can bestow blessings upon clerics in particular. So this is Narog the Hunter, or Nargog the Hunter. And Bestial Metamorphosis is our final spell. At the very end, we start getting into our adventures. So Chapter 8 is our first adventure. This one is a funnel. So you're going to get your bunch of level 0 characters, run through, and see how many are going to survive. My main complaint about this adventure is that it's very linear. It doesn't look super linear from this map right here. I believe you start over here in 1A. But because this looks like a grid that you can explore, but there's really not a whole lot to explore in there. Most of these caves are just rooms where you see some strange paintings and then something happens to you. There's not a lot of interactivity, is what I'm saying. You are going to get ambushed once or twice as you go past these star symbols. An enemy's going to run out of the mist and attack you and then run off again. But there's not a lot of choices that you're really making as far as I could tell. And then once you find your way out of this whole labyrinth, you end up over here. It's pretty much a straight shot to the end. So I would have liked to see a lot more choices players could make, more things that they could mess with, ways that they could alter the ending or the events in some way, but it really does kind of march in a very particular order. There's not a lot of control that you're going to have over it. Our second adventure is a Hex Crawl at the end here, and this is a lot nicer in the sense that Hex Crawls do allow for a lot more exploration and a lot more player control over what's going on here. So you're going to have encounters that are listed for the different types of terrain, road encounters, plains encounters, etc. The basic structure here is that it's a clock that's slowly ticking down. You have some enemy cultists that are trying to cause a undead magical catastrophe. In order to do so, what they're doing is they're traveling to some of these towns, and as they travel to these 5 towns, they're basically creating a giant pentagram on the land. And once they complete that, then their ritual is complete. So this is going to rely on the players being able to find out what these cultists are doing, track them down. If they're smart, they'll be able to figure out that they're making a giant pentagram shape, and that'll allow them to anticipate where they're going to go next. So there's a lot of great elements there that I enjoy. A couple of problems that I noticed are, well, for one thing, the way that these hexes are labeled is very confusing. So let me see if I can turn this a bit so we can see a bit better, because it's, like I said, it's hard to hold this open. It starts off with A2, interestingly, and then it goes A4, A6, A8, A10, and then B1, B3, B5, B7. It's a very confusing numbering scheme, so it makes it hard to look up exactly where a hex is when you need it. So over here, we just start off with, hex A2, A4, A6, and then it's just a bit hard to figure out where things are. You also have your 5 towns that the cultists are traveling to, and I think it would have been really nice to just label those towns 1 through 5 in the order that they're traveling, because I don't think they actually are in the way that this is set up, and that doesn't make it terribly easy to figure out where everyone's going. So the movement of the Death's Head cultists go from town 8, which is a certain farm, to 2, and then from 2 to 7, and then from 7 to 3, and then from 3 to 5, and then 5 to 8. Yeah, like I said, I would probably write those notes on the map just to make things a bit easier to run. But there is a lot of encounters, different types of encounters based on the terrain. It can be for forests, mountains, rivers, hills, roads, or plains. And each of the different settlements has a much larger write-up. Again, we have the issue here where we have these very long lines where nothing is really bolded or highlighted, so it's a bit hard to parse it on the fly. You would have to read this carefully ahead of time, probably make some notes and highlight stuff yourself to make it a bit easier to read and to run. And that's the end of our book right there. So as I mentioned before, this book is probably a great resource if the undead are a big focus of your campaign and you just want a lot of resources to make that a bit more flavorful and a bit more interesting and have more variety, especially if you're running Dungeon Crawl Classics, because it is designed for that. But most of the tables are quite system neutral, so it should be pretty useful for no matter what fantasy role-playing game you happen to be running. All right, that's it for this review for today. As usual, links are down in the description below. And thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.